this is Alan Wheeler with a short video for my online American literature students, hopefully to introduce a few of the values and poetic techniques of Walt Whitman as one of your first discussion forums is due soon. And the directions for that asks you to respond to one of 4 quotes explaining its meaning and how it shows Whitman's values or poetic techniques. So briefly, I'd just like to touch on a few examples of these just to give you maybe a handle on how to address the quote of your choice. So I've prepared a list of some of the values and some of the poetic techniques that are commonly found in Whitman's poetry. And so in almost any of the ones I have provided for you this first week on Blackboard, you will see references to America. You'll see the values of democracy and the common people rather than some kind of elite value system or aristocratic upper class attitude. Individualism is celebrated. Diversity also. But I put unity in parentheses as there's a spiritual, transcendental oneness shared by the individuals that Whitman celebrates. Also, like many romantics, there's a love of nature and a lot of natural imagery. Freedom. And Whitman breaks with tradition and loves originality. And we can see that in the very form of his poetry. So this is expressed in the free verse, which is actually a poetic technique, but you'll see as we go through here, you can't really separate the meanings and values easily from the techniques themselves. So when you look at a poem like Song of Myself, just the printed words on the page, you see there uneven lines and stanzas of different lengths, and not the traditional, more formulaic poetry. So we call that free verse. But let me highlight just a few lines and look at some of these values. So as far as individualism, the Song of Myself, the title itself, focuses on the individual. And it opens, I celebrate myself and sing myself, and what I assume, you shall assume, for every atom belonging to me, as good belongs to you. I loaf and invite my soul, I lean and loaf at my ease, observing a spear of summer grass. So here we see nature, individualism. We see that unity as what I am is shared by you, assumed by you. What you are is assumed by me. And we see in this central metaphor, it's actually an extended metaphor because the first collection of Whitman's poems was called Leaves of Grass. And here he references a spear of grass, a single individual standing rooted in this soil. But combined with all the other individuals, it makes up a field or a yard, a landscape that is a unified whole. So nature is used to express this kind of transcendental vision. That blade of grass, part of a greater field of grass. Let's look at some of the the poems that I have linked for you. And the first is a little different in form from most of Whitman's poetry. So here we'll look at some of these poetic techniques in the poem, "O Captain, My Captain," that you can find linked there. And so first, let's look at the allusion being made in this poem, the extended metaphor, and the use of apostrophe. And although we could consider this free verse, it is more formulaic, as each stanza is about 8 lines, and they follow more of a pattern than Whitman commonly does. But if we look at the poem, your pre-reading questions ask, to whom is the speaker talking? Where is this poem taking place? And if you Google this poem, some of the first information that will pop up is that Whitman wrote this poem shortly after the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. And so we know that the captain that he speaks of is the president, and that the fearful trip that he alludes to here is the end of the Civil War. Again, the extended metaphor, which is one of our poetic devices here, is the ship that has weathered the storms and is coming victoriously to shore, is the end of the Civil War. But it's weather-racked, and the port is near, and though all the people are exulting, the speaker of the poem is broken-hearted, for he sees, on the deck my captain lies, fallen, cold, and dead. So we've got the allusion to the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln. We have the extended metaphor of this ship coming into shore. And we have what's called apostrophe. Now, this is not the little punctuation mark, but this is the literary device. And in this case, apostrophe means speaking to someone or something that is not really there. The classic example is in Hamlet, when Hamlet speaks to the skull. It says, "Alas, poor Yorick, oh fanciful feather," and whatnot. And in this case, "O Captain, my captain," he's obviously not there, because even in the extended metaphor, he's fallen, cold, and dead. And at the end of each of those stanzas, you've fallen, cold, and dead. In the final stanza, fallen, cold, and dead. So these are some of the poetic techniques, and you can see the antithesis or contrast between the crowds cheering and the speaker, who is mournful in that poem. Very artfully done. So let's look at some of the examples that are more obviously free verse, just wild, expressing that wild break with tradition and originality in the very form of the poems. And a few, though wild and untamed, it's not without the use of poetic devices and technique. So we'll look at a few here. The use of catalog, repetition and parallelism, and alliteration, to name a few. So in the next, I believe it's the next poem that's linked, I Hear America Singing. You can see the irregular size of the lines and the stanzas in the very printed page. But as you read the poem, you begin to see that this is a use of literary catalog. So this is a very famous and even traditional technique. And in the old epics like the Odyssey and the Iliad, there would be these listings of ships in an armada, or the items of armor worn by a soldier, or the various dishes brought in for a great feast. And perhaps the most famous is the genealogy of Jesus in the Bible, where the fathers and sons are enumerated in a catalog fashion. In this case, I hear America singing, and if you just read the beginning of each line, it's the mechanics and the carpenter, the mason, the boatman, the shoemaker, the woodcutter, the plowboys, the singing of the mother, the girl sewing or washing. And so we get a listing or catalog of all these diverse jobs, all these occupations and workers in America. But the use of this repetition of the verb singing and the parallel form of each of these lines underscores a unity in this diversity. So the shoemaker is singing, and there's the woodcutter's song. The carpenter is singing, the mason singing, the boatman singing, and so on. The final line, singing with open mouths their strong melodious songs. And even the title, I hear America singing. So this repetition and parallel structure give unity to the language, but also express this unity and diversity of American value. So let me just close here and return to the beginning of Song of Myself. And I'll just take a brief moment to note sometimes the originality and expressiveness of Whitman, especially in his time, is a little controversial. So I'll just give you an example of a line. He refers to himself. Usually when we read poetry, we assume there's a speaker, a persona, that's not the biographical, literal author. But in this case, he identifies his persona as himself, Walt Whitman. But again, not necessarily the biographical Walt Whitman. Walt Whitman, a cosmos, turbulent, fleshly, sensual, eating, drinking, and breeding. And so this kind of expressive, and some of his poetry is more sexually explicit, and that breaks with tradition, and very controversial at the time that it was published. But let's return to the beginning. As Whitman says, I celebrate myself. This is the beginning of Song of Myself. I celebrate myself and sing myself in what I assume you shall assume, for every atom belonging to me as good belongs to you. I loaf and invite my soul. I lean and loaf, at my ease observing a spear of summer grass. So you can see this repetition and parallel structure kind of used in the place of old-fashioned or traditional meter and rhyme. So instead of that old iambic pentameter, that steady beat, and rhyme schemes of A, B, C, A, B, C, and so on, we get these other poetic devices. And I loaf and invite my soul. I lean and loaf. And those repeated letters and sounds, alliteration, punctuation, the repeating of the consonant letters at the beginning of those words, Eileen and loaf, and the repeating of those vowel sounds, the assonants as well. So there's a brief dip, and you can kind of mix and match some of those common techniques and common meanings found in Whitman's poetry as you respond to your first discussion forum. Thank you so much, and we'll see you in class or online.